Galaxy's deadliest creature broke free, found fast asleep in the Deathworld girl's room. The cultivation bay smelled like soil and the end of Keth Draal's career. He was aware of this in the way he was aware of most things at 3:40 ship time, through the monitors, at a remove, with the particular quality of attention that comes from having been awake for 19 hours and counting. 6 feeds, 6 angles on 6 different zones of the Aldrun, all of them useless. The AI said in its calmest possible voice, "Tracking signal for specimen null ray has been lost. Last confirmed position, containment chamber Velt 3, current status, chamber walls dissolved. Retrieval teams Tier 8 Alpha and Tier 8 Beta, signal lost. Threat index assessment, recalculate." Keth's jaw stress glands went amber. He touched them, a reflex, then stopped. They were going to get worse before they got better. No sense nursing them now. "How long," he said, "did the wall take?" Combined alloy rating, Tier 8 resistant. Dissolution time, 4 seconds. He sat with that for a moment. 4 seconds for something rated to hold a Class 7 entity in perpetuity. He pulled up the last clean frame from Velt 3 internal camera, the one that had been transmitting right up until it wasn't. Null ray in frame, folded into the corner, every joint pointed in a direction that shouldn't work anatomically. Eyes like holes. Head tilted toward the camera at an angle that was either curiosity or the last thing the camera ever saw. Then white, then nothing. Keth added the frame to the incident log. He labeled it Final Known Position, Specimen Null Ray, 3:27 ship time, and set the timestamp. The AI was still talking. Somewhere down the line, Director Seko's voice broke through, sharp with the specific authority of a man who had handled this kind of thing before and had the record to prove it. "Full lockdown, all crew to sealed quarters. Doctrine 1 event. Keth, I need a location." "Working on it." He was not working on it in any way he felt good about. Null ray had dissolved the tracking implants. The AI confirmed this with the enthusiasm of a system that had never had to say such a thing before and was processing the novelty of it at processing speed. The implants were rated to survive hull breach. They had lasted, the AI unhelpfully calculated this, approximately 6 seconds. 2 seconds longer than the wall, a small mercy. Keth ran the ship's motion sensors. They gave him corridors full of scared crew moving toward their quarters and not much else. The specimen was either very still or was generating some kind of interference the sensor array hadn't been built to account for. He tagged the motion sensor gaps, 12 of them across the lower decks, which was too many to mean nothing, and started eliminating by probability. Then a ping. Low priority, tagged by the AI as janitorial drone, deck 9, cultivation bay, sensor sweep, non-relevant, no action required. The AI had good instincts most of the time. Keth overrode it. He pulled the feed. The cultivation bay was intact. No dissolved walls. No evidence of a Tier 8+ event. The grow lights were running their night cycle, low and amber, and the root clusters of the tuber plants were throwing soft shadows across the floor. It smelled like soil in there, probably. Keth had been in the bay twice, both times to retrieve research equipment, and the smell of it was one of the few ship smells he found tolerable. Under the largest root cluster, against the base of the planting bed, there was a human. She was lying on her back, one arm over her eyes. A thermos sat on her chest, rising and falling slowly. Beside her right hand, a piece of flatbread, half-eaten, the rest sitting in an open tin with a faded stamp on the lid. She appeared to be asleep. She was not alone. Keth's glands went from amber to the shade of amber that the medical reference charts classify as significant distress event. He stared at the feed without moving for 11 seconds. He counted them later, reviewing the log. Coiled around the human, with the precise fit of something that had arranged itself deliberately, was specimen null ray, skull plating like compressed rock, triple-jointed limbs folded inward, eyes open, lightless, tracking the grow light's slow rotation across the ceiling. Its breathing was a low vibration in the bay's air recyclers. Keth could see it in the subtle movement of the root clusters. The human's thermos rose and fell. Null ray's head lowered, fractionally, and then settled again. It was watching the ceiling, or it was watching the drone. It was not, apparently, concerned about either. Keth opened a channel to Director Seko. "I have located Null Ray," he said, in the driest voice he owned. "It is in the cultivation bay. It appears to be resting with the biologist." A pause. "Say that again." Keth said it again. He did not add anything to it. The footage was going to do that work. Director Seko watched the feed for 45 seconds without speaking. His office was small and very clean, the kind of clean that comes from discipline rather than cleaning staff, everything in assigned positions, a tally board on the left wall with 34 marks in a column labeled "Contained." He had been building that tally for 19 years. He watched the footage with his arms crossed and his posture completely unchanged, and Keth, watching him from the channel window, took no comfort from this. When Seko spoke, it was the voice of a man who had found the variable and filed it correctly. "Human Voss is a biological researcher, Keth. She has no threat profile, no containment training, and no classification above Tier 2. She is not a variable in this situation." Keth waited. "The cultivation bay," Seko continued, "has a distinct temperature differential from the rest of the lower decks. 2 degrees cooler, higher moisture saturation, low light spectrum in night cycle. It is functioning as an accidental containment analog. Null Ray is quiescent because the environment is producing a behavioral state we haven't seen before. The human is incidental. Once we identify the environmental parameters and replicate them in a proper zone, we can retrieve the specimen without engagement." "And human Voss is to be retrieved as well, yes. She is an asset that has wandered into an active Doctrine 1 zone without authorization. I want medical on standby. I want extraction ready at the bay entrance." He looked directly at the feed. "The human is not the variable, Keth. The room is." Keth noted this in the incident log. He noted it in the specific way he noted things when he had a feeling that he was going to be reading the note again under very different circumstances. He pulled Marin Voss's personnel file while Seko was still talking. "Tier 2 clearance, biological researcher, assigned to the Aldrun for the Dren Corridor Cataloging Project. No incident history, no containment crossover, academic background in xenobotany and organic adaptive systems, which was why she was on a ship like this cataloging Class 9 flora and not, apparently, locked in her quarters during a Doctrine 1 event." There was a field in the file Homeworld Origin classification that showed a code Keth didn't immediately recognize. The AI had tagged it, "Tier clarification pending, unusual Homeworld designation." It offered no further information. Keth marked it for follow-up and moved on. He had 6 monitors to manage and a specimen that had dissolved its retrieval teams in 4 seconds. The taxonomy of one biologist's Homeworld could wait. On the feed, Marin Voss shifted in her sleep. Null Ray's head moved with her, tracking the motion, and then settled again when she stilled. Keth noted this too, Null Ray tracking human Voss's movements during rest state. He paused, following movement, not initiating. He sat with the distinction for a moment, then he kept typing. The extraction team staged at the cultivation bay entrance at 4:01. 4 members, rated Tier 5 containment, which was the highest Seko was willing to put in the corridor on the grounds that anything higher would take longer to suit up, and time was a factor. They had a transit pod and a medical kit, and the kind of very careful body language that comes from having watched the Velt 3 footage. On the feed, Null Ray had not moved. On the feed, Marin Voss had. She'd rolled onto her side, tucked one arm under her head, and pulled the flatbread tin a little closer in the way people pull things closer when they're mostly asleep and aware, on some animal level, that something is nearby. The tin's lid had shifted. The stamp on it was fully visible in the frame, faded blue lettering, circular border, the middle worn to near illegibility. The AI scanned it automatically. Its cataloging protocol ran on everything in a camera field, and output, personal effects, colony manufacture, non-relevant. Keth looked at the stamp for a moment, then he looked at Null Ray. The creature had not moved since the feed came online. 34 minutes of containment footage, and it had shifted twice, once when Marin moved, once when the drone's hover motor cycled. Both times it tracked, assessed, and settled, no threat display, no vocalization. Prior to capture on Dern 4, Nullray had dissolved 2 armored retrieval squads. The operational report used the word dissolved in its technical sense. There were no bodies to recover. Keth filed this under contrast, in the part of his mind that was already building the incident report and hating itself for it. He opened the extraction channel. Team is in position, on my mark. The team lead confirmed, ready. On the feed, Marin's eyes opened. Not the way someone startles awake. The way someone surfaces from sleep already aware of the room, one eye, then the other, slow and level. She lay still for a moment looking at the grow lights. Then she cracked her neck. Then she turned her head and looked directly at Nullray with the particular expression of someone who has found an unexpected thing and is deciding how alarming it is. She appeared to decide, not very. "Oh," she said, in a voice still rough from sleep, "you're huge." Nullray's head shifted toward the sound. The lightless eyes moved. Marin reached sideways, broke a section off the flatbread, and held it out flat on her palm. "Here, don't know if you eat this, but it seemed rude not to offer." Nullray sniffed the flatbread, then it took it, then it ate it. Marin nodded once, as if this confirmed something she'd suspected. "Cool." She set the thermos upright, checked that it wasn't going to tip. "Don't knock over the thermos. The barley tea is the last good thing on this ship, and I'm not losing it." She put her arm back over her eyes. On the extraction channel, silence. Keth's glands were fully amber. He could feel the heat of them along his jaw. "Hold," he said. "Holding," the team lead confirmed. Her voice had a quality it hadn't had 30 seconds ago. Keth watched the feed. Nullray finished the flatbread. It lowered its head again. The grow lights cycled. The thermos stood upright. Marin's breathing slowed back to the rhythm of someone who has returned, without fuss, to sleep. He opened a new incident log entry. He stared at the cursor for a moment. "Specimen Nullray," he typed, "has accepted nutritional offering from human VOS, Marin, Tier 2, biological research. Behavioral state, quiescent. Human VOS behavioral state, also quiescent. I am filing this initial entry under sensor malfunction pending further review." He submitted it. He did not actually think it was a sensor malfunction. Outside the bay entrance, the extraction team waited. Inside, Nullray settled its weight and the root clusters swayed. Somewhere in the recycled air, something smelled like soil and something faintly sweet, and a thermos of barley tea stood exactly upright on the floor of a ship that was supposed to be in full Doctrine 1 lockdown, next to a human who had apparently decided the situation called for a nap. Keth had been doing this job for 11 years. He had a clean incident record. He had the instinct, developed over those 11 years, to recognize when something had gone outside the shape of what his frameworks covered. He had that instinct very strongly right now. He did not mark the log entry for closure. He left it open. He added a note at the bottom, follow-up Ray, homeworld designation, VOS, Marin, tier clarification pending. He looked at the feed one more time. Then he typed, holding extraction pending behavioral assessment, Doctrine 1 protocols maintained, further updates to follow. He submitted that too, and waited. If you're wondering whether the situation resolved itself quietly, stay close. It didn't. 3 hours later is not how the extraction team described it. They described it as an extended tactical pause in their incident subreports, which Keth was going to have to compile, along with the 18 other subreports currently stacking in his queue, and the AI's ongoing attempts to reclassify the event under an existing category and failing, and Director Secco checking in every 20 minutes with the patience of a man who had never needed more than 20 minutes before. Keth was managing all of this while watching the cultivation bay feed with the focused attention of someone who understood, at this point, that the feed was the only thing on the ship currently providing him useful data. What the feed had provided in the 3 hours since first contact. Nullray had not moved from its position around Marin Voss. Marin Voss had moved twice, once to drink from the thermos, once to open the flatbread tin again and eat a piece herself. Both times she had done so without looking at Null Ray, which was either recklessness or familiarity, and Keth could not yet determine which. The extraction team had eaten half their emergency ration bars in the corridor. The AI had attempted to rerun Null Ray's threat index 7 times. Each time the output was the same single word. The AI was not built for recursion of this kind and was, in Keth's professional opinion, beginning to find the situation as uncomfortable as he was. At 6:22, Marin sat up fully. She stretched, rolled her shoulders, made a sound of mild dissatisfaction with her own body. Then she looked at Null Ray with clear, sleep-steadied eyes. "I'm going to name you something," she said. "I can't keep calling you nothing. You've been polite." She looked at the creature for a moment. "Null, that works. If you're going to sleep on me, you get a name. That's the deal." Null Ray's head tilted. One triple-jointed limb shifted, almost imperceptibly, and then went still. "Good," Marin said, apparently satisfied. She reached for the thermos. "Now don't move while I drink this. I'm not a morning person." In his office, Keth typed, "Human Voss has designated a name for specimen Null Ray. Specimen has not objected." He stopped. He deleted "has not objected" and replaced it with response, behavioral stillness consistent with attention. He submitted it. He stared at the wall for 3 seconds. He reopened the entry and added, in a personal annotation field his supervisor rarely read, "She named it. She named it. Keth out." The shoulder showed up at 7:14. Keth noticed it on the feed because Marin shifted her weight to reach the thermos a second time, and Null Ray moved with her, adjusting its bulk the way a large thing adjusts when the smaller thing it's arranged around changes position, and in that adjustment, Marin's left arm moved wrong. Not dramatically, just a fraction past where it should go, and then a small, involuntary stop. She didn't make a sound. She set the thermos down carefully, and then she rotated the shoulder twice, slowly, and her expression did a thing that was not quite a wince. More like the face of someone taking an inventory and not thrilled with the results. Keth flagged medical. Getting medical clearance into the bay was, it turned out, a negotiation he was not party to. He watched it on the feed. The 2 medics, full blastrated suits, which the medical lead had insisted on, and Keth had not argued with, positioned themselves at the bay entrance. Null Ray, which had not reacted to the extraction team in the corridor 3 hours ago, reacted to these 2 within 4 seconds of their arrival. No vocalization, no threat display in any technical sense. It simply moved, one smooth repositioning, so that it was between Marin and the entrance, folded into a shape that made it look, if anything, larger than it was. The medics stopped. Marin looked up. She looked at the standoff. She looked at Null Ray. Her expression was the particular expression of someone who has an appointment they have already rescheduled once. "Hey," she said, "those are the shoulder people, they're fine." Null Ray did not move. Marin sighed. "I'll give you the good flatbread." She reached into the tin, broke off the larger of the 2 remaining sections, and held it up. "The piece I was saving, this is a meaningful sacrifice. You're going to want to acknowledge that." Null Ray stepped aside, exactly 1 meter. Its eyes tracked the medics the entire time. Marin looked at the medics. "You've got a meter, make it count." The medics made it count. The shoulder reduction took 40 minutes. Keth had the timestamp because the medics were operating with the slow, deliberate confidence of people who understood that moving quickly in this room was not an option. Null Ray watched every second. It did not move from its 1 meter position. It finished the flatbread in the first 3 minutes and then stood still in a way that was much more unnerving than movement would have been. Keth filed the entry. Human Voss has successfully leveraged nutritional incentive to achieve medical access to specimen Null Ray's proximal space. Specimen demonstrated spatial compliance, 1 meter clearance, held for 40 minutes. I have amended the incident log to include the category nutrition-based behavioral leverage. Notation: my supervisor is going to love this. Director Secco did not love this. The environmental variable, Secco said, when Keth briefed him, is producing a more complex behavioral array than anticipated. This doesn't change the retrieval timeline. Once we identify the exact parameters, We can replicate the air composition in Bay 7 and she used flatbread. A pause. The air composition, Seko said, is the primary variable. Keth did not say anything to this. He noted it in the incident log under Director Seko's operating model and moved on. The recovery bed arrived in the cultivation bay at 900. Standard medical procedure. Marin's shoulder was reduced, but the joint needed rest and monitoring, and the medical lead had recommended 8 hours horizontal. Keth had authorized it. He had authorized it specifically because he thought it would mean moving Marin to the medical wing, which would separate her from Null Ray, which would give him information about whether the creature's behavior was tied to her presence or to the bay itself. He did not get this information. Null Ray pushed the bed. Not aggressively, with a slow, deliberate application of force to the bed's left side that moved it in a direction that was not the medical wing. The direction it moved in was deeper into the cultivation bay, closer to the large root cluster, back to the spot where Marin had been sleeping. Keth sent a crew team. 4 members, unarmored. He judged that armor would read as threat, and he was trying to avoid that, with the specific task of retrieving the recovery bed and returning it to the medical wing's anteroom, where Null Ray would not have access. The crew team reached the bay entrance. They looked into the bay. Null Ray was between them and the bed, not threateningly, just present in the particular way that a thing is present when it is also the largest thing in the room. The crew team filed 6 separate incident reports from the corridor. Keth read them. They were all, in their various ways, reports about the experience of standing in a corridor holding a recovery bed while being looked at by something that had dissolved its retrieval teams in 4 seconds. I think it's decorating, Marin said. She was in the recovered bed, arm in a sling, eating a protein block she'd found in her jacket pocket. She looked at the crew team. She looked at Null Ray. Just leave the bed, it's fine. A pause. It's not fine with the weight limits, probably, she said to Null Ray. You can't keep moving furniture. The ship has structural load ratings. Null Ray sat down. Marin considered this. Yeah, okay. She broke the protein block in half and held one half out. Good problem solving. Keth's entry, the specimen has incorporated human Voss's medical equipment into an arrangement in the cultivation bay consistent with nesting behavior in several Class 6 and Class 7 species. This is the first documented instance of Null Ray displaying habitat modification behavior. The doctrine does not cover this. I am adding a footnote. The footnote says, help. The crew team went back to their stations. The bed stayed. The cultivation bay now had a recovery bed, a root cluster arrangement, a thermos of barley tea, a flatbread tin, and the galaxy's most dangerous known organism. Keth catalogued all of this accurately and without, he felt, sufficient credit for his composure. The diplomatic attaché arrived at 1100. Keth had not summoned the attaché. The attaché had summoned itself, which was one of the things diplomatic attachés were authorized to do in Doctrine 1 events, and which Keth had temporarily forgotten when he'd filed the broader incident report to the Interspecies Council liaison. The liaison had apparently escalated. Things had apparently moved quickly after that. The attaché's name was Vel-Orn. Species, Drethian, bilateral, compound eyes that processed motion in 12 simultaneous sectors and gave their owners the particular unblinking quality of something that has never in its evolution needed to blink, armor-plated under the diplomatic uniform. Keth knew this because the ship's scanner updated automatically when new life signs came aboard, and Vel-Orn's body mass reading included approximately 40 kilograms of integrated defensive structure. Vel-Orn's operating principle was simple, efficient, and completely standard. The human was to be transferred for debrief, the creature was to be assessed by a council-authorized team, and the Aldrun's captain was to submit a full incident report within 12 hours. The protocol ladder had clear provisions for this. Vel-Orn had the authorization documents. Keth escorted the attaché to the cultivation bay entrance. He had considered, briefly, explaining the situation in more detail before they arrived. He had decided against it on the grounds that any explanation he gave would sound exactly as unlikely as it was. The cultivation bay, when Vel-Orn entered, smelled like soil and something warm. The protein block wrapper was still on the floor and looked like a place where someone had been living for a few days rather than a few hours. The recovery bed was nested against the root cluster. The flatbread tin was on a shelf Marin had apparently cleared for it. The thermos was within arm's reach. Marin was on the floor, cross-legged, with a set of color-coded rings in front of her. The rings were from the xenobotany kit. She'd requisitioned them that morning via supply request Keth had approved without reading carefully. They were sorted by color: red, blue, green, yellow. Nullray was sitting across from her, approximately 2 meters away, watching the rings with the focused attention of something that had decided this mattered. "Blue," Marin said, and pointed to the blue ring. Nullray did not move. "Blue," Marin said again, and tapped the ring with one finger. "This one here." Nullray's head tilted. Vel-Orn stepped forward. "The human is to be transferred for debrief. This is a council directive under clause." Nullray stood. It did not vocalize. It did not make a threatening gesture. It simply went from sitting to standing in one motion, and the change in the room was immediate and total, the way a change in air pressure is immediate and total. You don't see it, you just know it, at whatever level of your nervous system handles that category of information. Vel-Orn had compound eyes that processed motion in 12 sectors. All 12 of them processed Nullray at the same time. "Easy," Marin said. She hadn't looked up. "He's just doing his job." She picked up the blue ring and held it toward Nullray. "Blue, focus. We're in the middle of something." Nullray made a sound. The sound cracked the recording sensor mounted in the upper left corner of the bay. The sensor went dark. Keth noted this in the log: sensor failure, containment environment, unspecified acoustic event, and added it to the replacement queue. This was not, he was aware, the most important thing happening in the room right now. Vel-Orn had not moved. Nullray was looking at the attaché. Marin was holding up a blue ring. After 4 seconds, Keth counted them on the timestamp. Nullray sat back down. Marin nodded. "There we go." She set the ring on the floor. "She's still learning blue," she said to Vel-Orn. "It's a whole thing." Vel-Orn left the room without speaking. This was probably the right call. Keth intercepted the attaché in the corridor. He received the incident summary, 14 pages, compiled in transit, titled in official council formatting, "Human Behavioral Anomaly. Recommend immediate classification review." He signed for it. Vel-Orn departed. Keth stood in the corridor with 14 pages and the recording of a sound that had destroyed a sensor, and he looked at the bay entrance for a moment. He did not go in. He went back to his desk and read the summary. It was thorough. It contained footage timestamps, behavioral notation, and a formal recommendation that the human crew member designated Voss, Marin, be reclassified pending full review, based on observed anomalous behavioral interaction with a non-indexable apex entity. The language was diplomatic and precise, and gave absolutely no indication that the Classification Review Committee was going to know what to do with any of this. Keth forwarded it to Director Secco. In the subject line he wrote, "Diplomatic removal order failed. Further details in summary. Also, blue is a whole thing." Secco called back within 3 minutes. For the first time in this event, his voice had a quality Keth didn't have: a clean label for not alarm, not confusion, something in between. He watched the footage from the bay. He watched Vel-Orn leave without speaking. He watched Marin continue the color lesson. "The human wasn't refusing the order," Keth said. "She was mid-lesson." Secco said nothing for a moment. The specimen enforced the refusal independently. "Yes, based on what she was doing." "Based on," Keth said, "what she was doing, yes." Another silence. "The environmental variable," Secco said slowly, "does not explain a protective response that differentiates between a removal order and a medical team." "No," Keth said, "it does not." He let that sit. Secco let it sit too. Across the corridor on the bay feed, Nullray had taken the blue ring in its front limb, gently, precisely, and set it back in front of Marin. Marin looked at this. She looked at Nullray. Her expression had, for the first time since Keth had been watching her, a quality that was not quite flatness. something more like the look of someone who has run a calculation and found the answer interesting. "Home," she said. She picked up the blue ring, she held it out again. Blue. Nullray took it, set it down, waited. Keth stared at the feed. His jaw glands were amber-glowing gold, a color the medical reference charts put under acute stress response. He didn't touch them. He had 5 doctrine categories he could apply to this event. He ran through all 5. None of them covered an apex entity learning color identification as a voluntary activity in response to positive reinforcement from a Tier 2 biologist who was using the lesson as an excuse not to be debriefed. He opened a new entry. He typed for 30 seconds. He stopped. He had not, in 11 years, filed a report he couldn't finish. He finished it now because the job required it, but the last line came out wrong and he knew it. Specimen Nullray has demonstrated voluntary targeted behavioral response to human VOS's instruction during an active diplomatic intervention. Protective response appears to extend to operational decisions made in human VOS's immediate context. I don't have a form for this. He submitted it. He looked at the feed. On the shelf, under the grow lights, the flatbread tin sat with its worn stamp facing the room. The AI had scanned it again automatically. Its cataloging protocol was nothing if not thorough, and output, again, personal effects, colony manufacture, non-relevant. Keth looked at the stamp for a long moment. Then he pulled Marin's file back up. The homeworld field, the flag, tier clarification pending, unusual homeworld designation. He had marked it for follow-up 6 hours ago. He had not followed up. He was following it up now, except that the field linked to a subregistry that linked to a colonial classification archive that required a separate access request, and the access request had to go through the ship's administrative system, which was, he checked, currently processing 39 other requests from the Doctrine 1 event backlog. He submitted the access request. He set a flag on it, priority. He did not know what he was going to find there. He had a feeling, the specific feeling of someone who has been cataloging the wrong thing for 6 hours, that it was going to reframe some things. He went back to the feed. Marin was teaching Nullray the green ring now. She had given up on blue for the moment. "We'll come back to it," she told the creature. "Blue is abstract. Green is easier. Green is the color of the grow lights when they're running warm." Nullray looked at the grow lights, looked at the ring, looked at Marin. "Exactly," she said. Outside the bay, across the ship, Director Secco was sitting with footage and a diplomatic incident summary, and a certainty model that had very quietly developed its first crack. Not a visible break, not something he'd name yet, but the kind of thing that runs along a load-bearing wall when the load it wasn't designed for is applied slowly from below. He had 34 marks on his tally board. He had never needed a new column. He was, for the first time, thinking about columns. The access request came back at 13:47. Keth almost missed it. He was tracking 6 things at once: the rung 6 situation, which had developed faster than he'd expected, a structural integrity ping from the cultivation bay's load sensors, and Director Secco's latest message, which had the quality of a man in the process of reformulating a position he'd held for 19 years and not yet willing to say so out loud. The access request notification arrived in a queue with 38 other items, and the admin system had filed it under general correspondence. He flagged it, set it aside. He'd read it after the corridor situation resolved. The corridor situation was this. At 1300, Marin had asked Keth, through the bay's internal comm, in the tone of someone asking about meal schedules, whether she was medically cleared for light activity. He'd checked with the medical lead. The answer was yes, with restrictions, no overhead lifting, nothing strenuous, arm in the sling. "Great," Marin said. "I'm going to take Null for a walk." Keth had stared at the comm for 3 full seconds before responding. "I'm sorry." A walk down the food corridor, the commissary level. "She's been in this bay for 12 hours and I think she's getting restless." A pause. "Also, I'm out of flatbread and I need to resupply." He had attempted, in the next 4 minutes, to explain why this was not a procedure the Aldrun's doctrine covered. Marin had listened to all of it. Then she'd said, "The other option is she stays in here and finds her own entertainment, and the bay walls are rated Tier 6. The bay walls were rated Tier 6. Nullray had dissolved Tier 8 in 4 seconds. Keth had authorized the walk. He'd also sent a ship-wide notification, quiet, non-alarm, phrased as a routine corridor use advisory, that the food corridor and commissary level would be temporarily restricted to essential personnel. He'd done this in the 90 seconds between Marin's request and his authorization, on the grounds that there was no version of this that went fine if people were eating lunch in it. The snack cart was Marin's idea. She had found it in a supply alcove off the cultivation bay, a standard catering unit used for research deck meal deliveries, with a flat top and 2 lower shelves that currently held ration packs and a row of sealed protein boxes. She had loaded the top shelf with the contents of the commissary supply closet nearest to the cultivation bay, which Keth had unlocked for her because refusing to at that point seemed like the wrong priority. She walked with the cart. Nullray walked beside her. This was Keth watched it on the corridor feeds, drone relayed, not the word walked in any ordinary sense. Nullray moved the way large predators move in open space, which is to say that every part of the corridor changed quality when it entered it. The ceiling clearance was 40 centimeters above Nullray's skull plating, and the creature seemed to be tracking this in some automatic way, holding itself at a height that left exactly that margin. Keth didn't know if this was deliberate. He didn't know if Nullray had been in corridors before. He made a note to find out, and then remembered that finding out would require accessing records he didn't yet have clearance to see, and the only records he was currently awaiting clearance to see were in the Colonial Classification Archive, and his access request was sitting in his queue. He would read it after the corridor situation resolved. "This is the commissary," Marin told Nullray. Her voice was flat and informational, the tone she used for all of it. "Lots of smells. The ration packs smell like a decision someone regretted, so ignore those. The good shelf is the one with the nut bread." Nullray's head moved slowly, tracking the smell gradients down the corridor. It moved the way something moves when it is experiencing a lot of sensory input and organizing it by priority rather than overwhelmed by it. Keth noted this. He noted everything. A Gorlak technician appeared at the far end of the corridor, one of the essential personnel exceptions, coming off a shift in the engine room and apparently not having received the corridor advisory or having received it and decided temporary restriction applied to other people. The technician came around the corner, saw Marin with the cart, then saw what was beside Marin with the cart. The technician dropped a full crate of ration packs. The crate hit the floor and split, and ration packs scattered the length of the corridor. The technician was gone before the last one stopped moving. Marin watched the empty corridor for a moment. "We're still working on public relations," she said. Nullray watched the scattered ration packs, then it looked at Marin. "No," Marin said, "those have been on this ship for 8 months. Nothing good happens after you eat them." Nullray looked back at the packs, looked at the cart. Its tail, Keth had not, until now, fully catalogued the tail, moved once, a slow sweep that cleared a half-meter section of corridor floor. "I know," Marin said. "It's a lot of waste. It bothers me too." She pushed the cart forward. Nullray followed. They passed the scattered ration packs. They passed a junction where 2 engineering crew members had, apparently, been standing 30 seconds earlier and were no longer standing. Keth could see their access cards on the feed, dropped by the junction sensor. Both of them were logged as having re-entered a sealed corridor section at high speed. Then Marin raised her hand. She raised it the way you raise a hand when you're stopping to look at something casual, not a command, just the gesture of someone pausing. The hand went up, open-palmed, slightly to her right. Nullray stopped. Not immediately, not the way a trained animal stops, more like the way a very large thing stops when it has decided, on its own terms, to stop, and the timing of that decision happens to coincide with what you were doing. It stopped, and it waited. Marin had not trained this. There had been no session. She had raised a hand, mid-walk, and the thing that had dissolved 2 armored retrieval squads before anyone on this ship had ever seen it move had stopped and stood still in an open, uncontrolled corridor and waited. Keth's drone was 15 meters back. He watched the feed. He had stopped typing the incident report. He was just watching. Marin looked at a supply shelf mounted on the corridor wall, a floor-level snack shelf, the kind stocked with individually packaged nut bread squares for crew grab-and-go. She took one. She held it out to Null Ray, who took it from her hand with a delicacy that Keth found, somehow, the most alarming thing he had witnessed in a very long day. Null Ray's tail hit the wall, once, hard enough that the overhead lighting bracket on that section rattled and the feed flickered. "I know," Marin said. "They're good. The ship gets one thing right." She pushed the cart. They kept walking. Keth filed his report 2 hours later because the 2 hours between the corridor walk ending and the report being filed was spent doing something he didn't quite have a word for. Sitting, technically, watching the bay feed with the drone on standby. He typed the report in the flat, sequential way he always typed reports. He reached the end. He added a personal annotation. It read, Null Ray demonstrated voluntary behavioral inhibition in an open, uncontrolled environment at the request of a human operating a snack cart. I am going to take a moment. I have taken the moment. I need another moment. He submitted it. He looked at his queue, 32 items. He scrolled to the Colonial Classification Archive request, which had been sitting in the queue since 1347. He opened it. Holt 7. The field that had been flagged as unusual homeworld designation resolved to 2 words and a number. Holt 7, Class 9. Keth looked at this for a moment. Class 9 Deathworlds were a specific category in the Galactic Threat Registry, a category that existed mostly as a bureaucratic acknowledgement that some planets had fauna the registry's standard scale wasn't built to contain. Class 9 was not the top of the scale. It was the point at which the scale's methodology required separate assessment protocols because the standard ones produced numbers that couldn't be acted on. He pulled the Holt 7 registry entry, colonial settlement, established 3 generations back, active population, standard colonial infrastructure. He pulled the fauna registry for Holt 7. He read it slowly. He read the section on apex fauna twice. He read the section on colonial adaptation records once and then stopped. Then he pulled Marin's cortisol reading from the moment of first contact with Null Ray. The medical system had flagged it as a sensor error. He'd accepted this at 327 and not revisited it. The reading was 0.3 units above baseline. Baseline for a human in a neutral, unstressed state. Marin Voss, in the moment Null Ray had first entered the cultivation bay, when Keth's own stress glands had gone amber just watching it on a monitor from 3 decks away, had been 0.3 units above baseline. Not a sensor error. Her baseline was calibrated differently. The colonial adaptation records explained this in clinical language that Keth read with the focused attention of someone watching a very large piece of the last 16 hours slot into place. Holt 7 colonists, by the 3rd generation, developed what the registry called threat index desensitization consistent with native fauna exposure. The native fauna on Holt 7 were Class 9. Their threat index sat at the scale's upper limit. Null Ray's threat index was non-calculable. It exceeded the scale ceiling. But Marin's nervous system had been calibrated on a world where the Class 9 creatures were called the hairy problem by the people who managed them, the colonial fauna protocols noted, with a combination of patience, routine, and whatever was in your pocket at the time. 0.3 units above baseline, not she didn't understand the danger, not she was too calm to be reading correctly. She had understood. Her body had simply run the numbers against a different reference range and found Null Ray within tolerance. Keth sat with this for 37 seconds. He knew the exact length because his incident log time-stamped every manual pause, and he had made a deliberate choice to stop typing and sit with it, and the log had recorded this. Then he looked at the cultivation bay feed. Marin was asleep again. Her arm was over the flatbread tin, which was on the recovery bed beside her. The tin's stamp faced the room. He pulled the footage from rung 1, Marin tossing the flatbread, the flat voice, "Don't knock over the thermos." Holt 7 Colonial Fauna Protocols, Section 4, Nutritional Incentive Management, Controlled Food Reward, is a standard first contact de-escalation tool for apex fauna, documented effective across 12 Class 9 species. Page 1. He pulled rung 3, the flatbread for medical access. You've got a meter, make it count. Section 6, Spatial Negotiation, Graduated Proximity Increase using Nutritional Reward, Primary Tool for Medical Access in Field Conditions. See also, Bite Radius Management. He pulled rung 4, the bed. I think it's decorating. You can't keep moving furniture. Section 9, Nesting Behavior Management. When an apex specimen claims a habitat space around a trusted handler, the recommended protocol is non-confrontational accommodation. Disruption attempts escalate aggression in 92% of documented cases. He did not need to pull the diplomatic incident. He understood the diplomatic incident. Marin Voss had not been managing Nullray. She had been applying, from muscle memory, the standard field protocols she had grown up watching the people around her use on the things that lived on Holt 7, and which happened, because she was from a world where these things were the local fauna, to map almost exactly onto the behavior of something the rest of the galaxy classified as non-indexable. She had been trying to sleep. She had been trying to get her shoulder looked at. She had been trying to teach a creature to identify the color blue because it seemed interested, and she had the rings available. And every single one of those things had been, from a Holt 7 colonial perspective, correct. The corridor walk, the unrehearsed stop signal, Nullray standing perfectly still in an open corridor because a human had raised her hand. Section 12, Field Inhibition Commands, Standard upper body gesture, palm outward, used when a handler needs to pause apex specimen movement in an uncontrolled environment. Effectiveness rating, trained handler, high. Effectiveness rating, untrained handler with significant prior proximity, also high, provided the specimen has established trust bonding with the handler. In Holt 7 colony records, this gesture was documented as effective on first attempt in 41% of bonding cases. Marin hadn't trained it, she just used her hand. He was in the middle of the file when he realized his jaw glands had gone past amber. Past the shade, the reference chart called acute stress response. They were at a color he didn't have a quick word for. The chart called it paradigm adjacent, which was medical shorthand for the body's response to information that required updating a large number of things at the same time. He called Director Seko. Seko picked up on the first signal. He was, Keth could tell from the audio, still in his office, still near the tally board. "I have the homeworld file," Keth said. A pause and... Keth read him the designation, Class 9. He read him the cortisol figure. He read him the 3 lines from the colonial adaptation record that covered what the third generation of Holt 7 colonists were like, physiologically, relative to the fauna they grew up near. Then he said, "The flatbread is in the field protocols, Section 4. Seko said nothing. The medical access, the nesting accommodation, the inhibition gesture in the corridor. Keth stopped. He was reading ahead in the file now. Director, the Holt 7 colonial fauna protocols have a section on what they call bonded trust handling, the criteria for specimens selecting a handler rather than the handler selecting a specimen, the behavioral markers." He read Seko the markers. He read all 5 of them. Nullray had displayed all 5, starting approximately 4 minutes after first contact. In Seko's office, silence, a long silence, not the silence of a man processing new information, the silence of a man whose processing had very quietly completed and who was sitting with the result. "She wasn't the incidental variable," Keth said. Seko did not answer. The room wasn't the variable, the environmental differential, the air composition, none of it. Keth looked at the feed. Marin was still asleep. The flatbread tin was still on the bed beside her. She was never not the variable. We were measuring everything except the right thing. Another silence. Then Seko said, in a voice that was still controlled but had a quality to it now, something stripped of certainty in the way a surface is stripped of paint, not violently, just completely. Send me the full file. Keth assented. He sat for a moment after. His glands were the color that didn't have a quick word. He looked at the bay feed. He looked at the flatbread tin on the bed beside Marin's arm. Built to protect food on a Class 9 world. Colony issue, Deathworld grade. He had been looking at it for 16 hours. The AI had scanned it twice and called it non-relevant. He opened a new incident log entry. He did not have a category for it yet. He titled it, Behavioral Leverage Item, Preliminary Designation, Pending Full Classification Review. He added a note. See also, Holt 7 Colonial Fauna Protocols, all sections. See also, Human VOS, Marin, Cortisol Record, Original Sensor Flag. Flag was incorrect. This was not a sensor error. He paused, then he added, I need to call the containment board. He submitted it. He did not close the file. The containment board convened at 900 the following morning. There were 7 members. Keth had served as presenting analyst for 4 prior board sessions, 2 routine threat reclassifications, 1 containment breach review, 1 incident that the board had subsequently reclassified as an administrative error with significant structural consequences, which was the kind of language institutions used when they needed something to be technically true and also not too clearly anything. He knew how the sessions ran. He knew the format. He knew that the board's purpose was to receive information, assess it against existing protocol, and issue a directive, and that the directive was almost always a version of something the doctrine had already anticipated. He submitted the file at 8:47. He included the full Holt 7 registry, the cortisol record with the corrected sensor flag, the colonial fauna protocols in their entirety, the footage from all 6 rungs of the incident sequence, and the diplomatic attaché's 14-page summary, which he labeled Exhibit F and placed last, because he wanted the board to have already seen everything else before they read the attaché's phrase human behavioral anomaly and understood exactly how accurate it was. The session lasted 40 minutes. Keth presented for 11 of them. He spoke in the flat sequential tone he used for all presentations, and he did not editorialize. He let the footage run. At rung 6, null ray stopping in the open corridor, 14 seconds, nutbread square, tail hitting the wall, a member of the board, senior analyst Orvath, who had been on the Aldrun longer than anyone except Seko himself, and who had a reputation for saying very little in sessions and being correct about most of it, said, Stop the feed there. Keth stopped it. Null ray, frozen mid-frame, skull plating grazing the ceiling, tail still extended from the impact, looking at Marin Voss with the lightless, attentive eyes that the threat index system had classified as non-calculable and then given up. She raised her hand, Orvath said. That's all she did. Yes, Keth said. And the specimen, which had, as of the previous month, dissolved 2 armored retrieval squads, stopped. For 14 seconds, then it waited. Orvath looked at the frozen frame for a long moment, and she wasn't trained for this. Keth thought about Section 12 of the Holt 7 Colonial Fauna Protocols. Standard upper body gesture, palm outward. He thought about Marin, mid-walk, raising her hand the way you raise a hand when you're stopping to look at something. Not by us, he said. Orvath did not say anything else. The board let the footage run to the end. The directive came at 10:23. Keth read it in his office, standing, because he had developed a habit over 11 years of standing when reading directives. The habit had no formal basis. It was just something he did. The directive was 3 pages. The first page was the formal doctrine amendment, the first in 19 years, which inserted a new section between Tier 6 and Tier 7 containment classifications. The section was titled Protocol Addendum, Non-Standard Handler Interaction, VOS Protocol. The second page was the reclassification order. Keth read it slowly. Specimen previously designated null ray, non-indexable threat, threat ceiling exceeded, reclassified, new designation, bonded tier 0 entity, primary handler, VOS Marin human Holt 7, operative protocol, VOS, containment status, active non-restrictive, handler authority, binding. Below the reclassification, in the standard format used for all doctrine entries, a single-line definition of the VOS protocol. Field methodology, in which a crew member of confirmed Deathworld origin is assigned as primary contact handler for non-indexable apex entities, utilizing behavioral leverage tools including but not limited to nutritional incentives, positive reinforcement, routine physical proximity, and verbal de-escalation in flat tones. Verbal de-escalation in flat tones. Keth looked at that line. He thought about "don't knock over the thermos." He thought about "we're still working on public relations." He thought about "she's still learning blue, it's a whole thing," said to a diplomatic attaché who had armor-plated compound eyes and the full authority of the Interspecies Council and had left the room without speaking. Verbal de-escalation in flat tones. Correct, technically, precisely, bureaucratically correct. He read the third page. The third page was a standing directive issued to all vessels operating in the Dren corridor and copied to the Interspecies Registry for Galactic Distribution. Following review of Incident DWG-001, Aldrun, this directive establishes the following amendment to Galactic Containment Classification Standards. Human crew members of verified Deathworld origin, Class 7 or above, are to be assessed under a separate biological stress profile when assigned to apex entity proximity roles. Standard cortisol baselines do not apply. Standard threat response metrics do not apply. Assessment protocols, pending development. Pending completion of assessment protocols, Deathworld origin crew members should be considered an unclassified variable in any containment scenario involving entities at or above Tier 6. Unclassified variable. 67 species currently operational in the Dren corridor. 67 sets of containment officers who would read this directive and encounter, for the first time, the category of human Deathworld origin in their threat assessment framework. And alongside it, standard metrics do not apply. Keth thought about Director Seko's tally board, 34 entries, every leverage point found, every outcome determined. He thought about the new column Seko had said the previous morning he was going to start. He thought about Seko's voice on the comm when Keth had read him the 5 bonding behavior markers from the Holt 7 protocols, and Null Ray had displayed all 5. The new column wasn't going to look like the other 34. He went to tell Marin. She was in the nest ward. The cultivation bay had been formally renamed in the reclassification paperwork, which Keth found, in an abstract way, appropriate, eating a protein block and reading something on a small screen. Null Ray was behind her, occupying most of the available floor space, apparently asleep. The grow lights were in their mid-cycle. The room smelled like soil and the faint sweetness that had been there from the beginning, which Keth now knew was the tuber plant Marin had been leaning against when all of this started. He knocked on the bay frame. Marin looked up. "Board session's done," he said. "I know, I heard the directive ping." He paused. "You have board directive access." "I have general shipcom access." The directive was a ship-wide ping. She looked at him. "I read fast." He thought about the 14-page diplomatic summary, Exhibit F, which he had placed last in the file on the assumption that the board would need to process everything else before reaching it. "The reclassification is formal," he said. "Null Ray is Tier 0. You're listed as primary handler." "I saw. The protocol is named." A pause. "I saw that too. The VOS protocol." Marin looked at her protein block. She looked at the small screen, which she had set face down when he'd knocked. She looked at Null Ray, who had not moved, who was breathing in the slow, deep rhythm it had developed sometime in the last 12 hours. The rhythm Keth's logs noted matched Marin's own sleep breathing at a lag of approximately 4 seconds. Does the protocol, Marin said, get me out of the species integration briefings? Keth looked at her. No. Then what's the point? He had been prepared to feel something when he told her, something like the institutional solemnity the moment seemed to require, the weight of what had just been formally entered into the galactic containment record. He had not been prepared to feel, instead, the specific thing he actually felt, which was the same thing he'd felt watching the corridor feed for 2 hours after the walk ended. The sensation of a framework encountering something it couldn't file, not because the thing was wrong, but because the framework's categories were, and had always been, one variable short. The protocol also, he said, covers your commissary access for flatbread resupply, standing authorization, any time. Marin looked up. That's more useful. I thought you'd think so. She set the protein block down. She looked at him for a moment, the level look, the same one she'd had in every feed, the look that the xenopsychology team had spent 48 hours trying to categorize and ultimately filed as a typical baseline. And then she said quietly, "Thank you for the file, for figuring it out." Keth thought about 37 seconds of sitting with the cortisol data while the incident log time-stamped his pause. He thought about the retroactive analysis, 8 pages, the most uncomfortable 8 pages he had ever written, which his supervisor had already flagged 3 annotations in for style compliance. The file did most of it, he said. Still, she picked the protein block back up. Is there barley tea anywhere on this ship? The commissary was out. He didn't know, he checked. Research deck supply locker, Section 14C, 2 full cases, apparently untouched since the previous resupply because most of the research deck staff preferred the synthesized tea and had never touched the barley stock. Section 14C, he said, I'll have it sent. Marin nodded. She went back to her screen. Behind her, Nullray made a low sound, not the boiler about to fail sound from rung 2, not the crack that had taken out a recording sensor in rung 5. Something slower. Something that the ship's audio sensors logged as vocalization, non-aggressive, classification pending. Keth's own glands registered it as the sound a thing makes when it has decided, on its own terms, that the room is satisfactory. He left them to it. The barley tea arrived at 11:40. Keth did not send it. He had intended to, had pulled up the supply request and left it open on his secondary screen, and then the directive distribution had required his attention, and then Orvath had sent 3 follow-up questions, and then the Colonial Classification Archive had flagged an update to the Holt 7 entry, a routine update, a notation that the entry had been accessed and cross-referenced in an active incident, the kind of automated record-keeping the archive ran without prompting. He looked at the update. The archive had, in its notation, auto-populated the Holt 7 entries related incidents field. The only item in the field was DWG-001, Aldrun, Dren Corridor. He thought about that. Holt 7's entry in the Galactic Registry, 3 generations of colonial records, fauna assessments, physiological adaptation data, and its only related incident was this one. He thought about how many other vessels were operating in the Dren Corridor, how many of them had crew, how many of those crew had origin records that included a homeworld classification and a cortisol baseline that the standard registry had accepted without pulling the footnotes. He thought about the directive, circulating now to 67 species, and the field it had opened, unclassified variable. Then he looked at his queue, which had 21 items, and he went back to work, because incidents don't file themselves, and the VOS protocol still needed its supplementary documentation attached, and the Holt 7 colonial fauna protocols, all 14 chapters, needed to be formally appended to the doctrine amendment. He was on chapter 7 when his comm pinged. Marin, the tea got here. Good. A pause, it's good tea. I know. Another pause, the kind of pause that Keth had learned sometimes preceded a follow-up question from Marin and sometimes preceded nothing at all. He waited. Null figured out blue, she said. He looked at his secondary feed. Cultivation Bay's nest ward, Nullray, was looking at a blue ring on the bay floor, then at Marin, then back at the ring. When did that happen? About an hour ago, between the directive ping and you coming by. She picked up the ring and held it out. Nullray took it very carefully. We're starting yellow next. Keth watched this on the feed. Nullray, non-indexable, threat ceiling exceeded, reclassified this morning as Tier 0, was holding a blue ring. Noted, he said. I'll add it to the log. He added it to the log. Subentry 51, Nullray successfully demonstrates color discrimination, Stage 2, blue, handler, VOS, training aid, ring set standard, reinforcement, not observed, ring return appeared self-reinforcing. He paused, then added, yellow next. He submitted the subentry. He went back to Chapter 7. The final incident report ran to 61 pages. Keth submitted it at 1800. His supervisor, who had been receiving the subentries in real time for the past 3 days and had developed what Keth could only describe as a calibrated response, a kind of pre-exhaustion at each new subentry subject line, sent back a single message that said, approved, pending style review, flag your personal annotations for removal. Keth looked at the personal annotations. There were 4 of them. He looked at the last one, which he had written after the retroactive analysis, after the Holt 7 file, after the cortisol data had resolved from sensor error into something else entirely. He had written it in the margin of subentry 47. It read, the protocol ladder had no rung for a species that simply didn't feel the drop. His supervisor had flagged it for removal. It was not clinical language. It was not protocol compliant. It was a personal annotation in a formal incident report, and the archive system's style compliance module had 3 separate reasons to reject it. Keth looked at it for a moment. He removed the other 3 annotations. He left this one. He submitted the final report. 2 days later, the Aldrun was in transit. Keth did the final walkthrough of the incident documentation at 700, the standard check he ran at the close of every containment event, every breach review, every incident that generated more than 10 sub-entries. He pulled the full file. He checked the event tally, 24 events, matching the target range. He checked the numbers. Each figure appeared once in the record, except the 3 anchors, Nullray's non-calculable threat index, Marin's cortisol reading, and the 3434 containment record, which was now annotated with a footnote that read C Protocol Addendum, VOS. He checked the open loops. The diplomatic attaché's incident summary had been formally acknowledged and filed. The xenopsychology team had submitted their updated report, which had replaced the phrase anomalous behavioral variance with Holt 7 baseline presentation throughout, and which had a new final section titled Implications for Handler Specimen Trust Bonding Research that ran to 20 pages and would, Keth suspected, generate its own archive entry within the year. The structural integrity ping from the cultivation bay's load sensors had been reviewed. Nullray's resting weight was within the bay's rated capacity, with a 12% margin. The corridor feed from Rung 6 had been archived under both the VOS protocol supplementary documentation and the ship's general incident archive, where it was currently the most accessed item in the Aldrun's history, having been viewed by every member of the crew at least once, and by Orvath 11 times. The access request from the Colonial Classification Archive was closed. The sensor error flag on Marin's cortisol reading was corrected. The tally board in Director Seko's office had, as of yesterday morning, a new column. Keth did the final check on the Echo object. The flatbread tin was logged under Behavioral Leverage Item, Class 1, CVOS Protocol, Supplementary Documentation, Section 4. He had photographed it himself, the morning after the directive, before Marin had noticed he was doing it. The tin on the shelf in the nest ward, the colony stamp facing the room, the dented lid with its scratched Holt 7 designation catching the grow light. Holt 7 standard issue, DATHWOLD grade. He had written a note in the log entry for it. His supervisor had not flagged this one. This object was manufactured to protect food on a world where the environment tried to take everything. It was the first object null ray voluntarily handled without dissolving. It was present at initial contact, all 6 trial rungs, the diplomatic incident, and the corridor walk. Classification, non-incidental, see all sections. He closed the log entry. He closed the file. At 7:30, he walked past the nest ward on his way to the analysis deck. The grow lights were in their early cycle, the pale blue-white that the tuber plants needed in the morning hours. Through the bay door, which Marin had stopped closing, she had simply stopped closing it, sometime around day 2, without comment, and no one had raised this because the relevant variable was not the door. Keth could see the room. Nullray was asleep. The skull plating rose and fell. Its tail was curved around the base of the recovered bed, which was back in the cultivation bay because the crew team had never successfully retrieved it, which was now in the doctrine as an example of the nesting accommodation section of the Voss protocol. Marin was asleep beside it, the way she'd been asleep at 2:47 on the first morning, before any of this had a name, one arm over her eyes, the flatbread tin on the bed beside her, the Holt 7 stamp facing up. The corridor was quiet, the ship hummed, the stars did what stars did. Keth stood there for 3 seconds. He noted this in no log. Then he went to work.